The sun rose over the southern English port of Southampton at about 23 minutes past 5 on Wednesday, April 10th, 1912, illuminating the docked Titanic, the world's newest and largest luxury liner, which 6.5 hours later would begin her inaugural voyage to America, with stopovers along the way at a northern French port and then a southern Irish one, before the 6-day journey across the Atlantic. What did the Titanic look like on this slightly overcast spring morning? Weighing in at just over 46,000 tonnes with a black hull and white superstructure set off by 4 funnels painted with the yellow and black signature colours of her operators, the White Star Line. You could identify ships by the colours used to paint their funnels, and in this golden age of shipping, the White Star Line Company was one of the brightest success stories. She was also, as a ship, just over 882 feet long, with the name Titanic inscribed onto her bow, the front of the ship, and at the back or stern you could also see the words Titanic, Liverpool. This particular detail often confuses people. Why Liverpool? The Titanic had been built in Belfast and it sailed from Southampton, so why was Liverpool the city name inscribed on her stern? Well, that's because the city on a ship denotes its port of registry, and the White Star Line headquarters were in Liverpool. But as I said, it was Belfast where she had been built and launched from the Harland and Wolff shipyards in the east of the city. You may have heard people referring to the Titanic's sister ships. This doesn't mean ships operated by the same company. The White Star Line ran many ships, all of which had names ending in the company tradition with IC-ic. But other ships they owned, like the Oceanic or the Cedric, weren't sister ships to the Titanic just because they were also White Star owned. I don't know, maybe they could be called cousin ships. I've said that in a moment of off-script whimsy, and now I'm afraid the incredibly precise nautical enthusiasts will come for me. I was only joking about the cousin ships point. Back on script, sister ships is a more specific category than that. It is when a series of ships are built of largely similar designs. They're not usually identical, but they are close enough to be regarded as quote-unquote sisters. The Titanic was the second of 3 sister ships, all designed to win back for the White Star Line the crown of owning the largest and most luxurious ships in the world. The first of these sisters, the Olympic, had entered commercial service a year earlier in 1911 to rave reviews. The press had slightly exhausted themselves with coverage of the Olympic, which meant that the Titanic really didn't get as much attention. But she was still referred to as the new Queen of the Ocean in publicity material. There were also a few improvements between the sisters. The Titanic, for instance, had a new extra cafe, the Café Parisien. It had a larger first-class restaurant and reception room. A new limited, larger class of suites available with their own private promenade decks as the most expensive ticket in first class. There had also been some pretty significant improvements to the crew's accommodation, as well as improvements in lighting and ventilation to the general room, which was the main socialising space for third-class passengers. Watching the tens of thousands of Belfast workers toil between 1908 and 1911 to build the Titanic and the Olympic before her, the North Irish writer Shan Bullock was particularly struck with the industry and ingenuity of Belfast's designers and workers. But Bullock was also deeply moved by just how much the Titanic represented the culmination in several generations of works in the size and capabilities of ocean liners. Here we have actor Cáilum Carragher reading Shan Bullock's eyewitness accounts of the skill and scale that went into building the Titanic, as well as Belfast's pride in the ship they had produced.
Boilers as tall as houses, shafts a lad's height and diameter, enormous propellers hanging like some monstrous sea animal in chains, turbine motors on which workmen clambered as upon a cliff, huge pneumatic hammers and quiet, slow-moving machines that dealt with cold and steel, shearing it, punching it, planning it, as if it had been dinner cheese. Then to the moulding loft, large enough for a football ground, and its floor a beautiful maze of frame lines, on through the joiners' shops where their tools can do everything but speak. The Titanic was an evolution rather than a creation, a triumphant product of numberless experiments, a perfection embodying who knows what endeavour, from this a little, from that a little more, of human brain and hand and imagination.
The Titanic was, as Shan Bullock so rightly asserted, the product of a remarkable evolution. After she was completed in Belfast at the start of April, she went to Southampton, where a few finishing touches were added over the course of a week before she set sail with her first passengers. And the shipping industry was a well-oiled, if you'll pardon the pun, machine by 1912. Many passengers sent their luggage ahead to speed up the boarding process when they got there. And so on this April morning, vast quantities of luggage were being brought on board the Titanic with White Star Company labels on each piece, clearly indicating where the owners wanted them stored. So, for instance, if a piece of luggage belonging to a first-class ticket holder had a shipping line label with the words cabin or stateroom on it, that indicated it should be taken to that passenger's bedroom. If they had written baggage room or wanted, it meant that it shouldn't go immediately to their accommodation, but it did contain items which they might want to access later in the voyage. So it would be held in a luggage room until they or a servant or a crew member went to retrieve it for them. If they had written not wanted on their luggage label, that luggage went deep into the ship's hold until the end of the voyage. We have such a nostalgic image of old suitcases covered with ocean liner stickers because they started as a useful trend for marking out where luggage should go, and then kind of became axiomatic with the image of travel by ocean liner. For convenience's sake, shipping lines didn't print these ticket labels for individual ships. This is still a business, albeit often a picturesque one, and efficiency is thus key. So the labels on this April morning wouldn't have read Titanic, but rather White Star Line, so they could be printed en masse and used for all of their ships. Likewise, if you were travelling on something like the Crown Princess and Cecily, the labels would have read Northern German Lloyd, or whether it was the Lusitania, the Caronia, or the Mauretania, the labels would say Cunard Line. And at this point, I'd like to take a moment to shout out to my friend Archie Seabag Montefiore, who can work a James Cameron Titanic quote into any situation. And at that mention of the Mauretania, he is now saying, wherever he's listening to this, like Rose, that he doesn't see what all the fuss is about because it doesn't look any bigger than the Mauretania. This luggage, actually I'm just thinking, if Archie never comments on this joke, I will know that he and Antonia haven't listened to it. Maybe I will pepper all the podcasts with personal bon mots to trap my friends. I jest, I'm sure he will. I'll let you know in episode 3. This luggage made its way onto the Titanic as the ship nestled next to a large shed that accommodated the technicalities of boarding. It also had railway lines running next to the ship, from which arrived 2 chartered boat trains to bring paying White Star Line passengers from London down to Southampton. The first of these boat trains was chartered to bring third-class ticket holders, and this was part of a tactical reason by White Star Line, which preferred to give third-class passengers a much longer embarkation window than those travelling in first or second class, and the reason for this is surprisingly touching. I came across why when I was researching my book on the Titanic. And at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, I was able to track down a travel guide from the time, or sort of travel aid for first-class passengers, written by a man called R.A. Fletcher. I think, if memory serves, it was published in, I think, 1913. And he explained to his readers why third class needed longer to board. And it was because most third-class passengers sailing to America were emigrants. And so it was a lot more emotional for them saying goodbye than tourists in second class or those with the money to travel regularly, like the passengers in first class. In 1912, immigration to America was big business. While some of the more elite shipping lines, like White Star Line, were increasingly making a huge amount of money from wealthy travellers, the shipping lines still earned their metaphorical bread and butter from third-class revenue. To give you an idea of the sheer scale of immigration into the United States at this time, in the course of the commercial year of 1912, the White Star ships alone, so this is one company in 1 year, transported 23,000 immigrants from Europe to a new life in America. So, White Star Line gave third class a longer boarding time for two reasons. The first was to check, as you may have seen dramatised in some movies, that in line with American quarantine and immigration legislation, none of the immigrants were carrying lethal or contagious diseases. And the other reason was because they knew a lot of third class would take a really long time to say goodbye at the pier to their loved ones staying behind, possibly forever and certainly for a long time. One third-class passenger who didn't feel any grief that morning was 31-year-old Elizabeth Dowdall, a New Jersey woman working as a governess and one of the few American citizens in the Titanic's third class. Elizabeth felt nothing but relief at the sight of the Titanic's shining black hull looming above her as she stepped off the train and towards the gangplank. Elizabeth had arrived at Waterloo train station in London on time for the third-class train, but something had gone wrong with the engine's brake valve moments after the train set off, meaning that there had been a delay causing Elizabeth to worry that they would miss the ship. Of course, the Titanic was thoroughly unlikely to leave without its boat train's arrival. That was a significant number of its passengers, but Elizabeth Dowdall wasn't to know that, and she had worried until the train set off again. Elizabeth boarded the Titanic with a 6-year-old girl, Ethel, but Ethel wasn't her daughter. She was her charge. Ethel's mother was an American opera singer on tour in Europe, and after her tour was extended, she had asked Elizabeth, as Ethel's governess, to take Ethel back home to her grandparents in America. It might seem a bit unusual to us that a child in the care of a governess would be travelling in third class, but years of media presentations have left us imagining that third class on the Titanic represented poverty, while first class represents extreme wealth. In fact, the White Star Line had such a high reputation for its cleanliness, food, comfort and safety in third class that tickets for it usually cost as much as they did for second class on other ships. Elizabeth and little Ethel had actually travelled over to Britain in second class on the Olympic, but while Ethel's mother was an opera singer, she evidently did quail at the cost of 2 tickets for Titanic's second class, especially after she had so recently paid that price for the Olympic, and so she sent her daughter and her governess back to America in the perfectly acceptable, to her and apparently to Elizabeth as well, 3rd class. The closest comparison I can make today is not to think of 3rd class as, say, the equivalent of a budget airline, but more like if you had a transatlantic economy or coach ticket with the likes of Aer Lingus, British Airways, Virgin Atlantic, or Delta. It's not something that would be necessarily very cheap, and you would expect a certain pretty decent standard of comfort while you travelled. The delay with the 3rd class train seems to have pushed back the boat train for 1st and 2nd class, who only arrived at about 11:30, and sailing time was due for noon. As the 1st and 2nd class passengers moved towards the ship from the train, society gossip columnists hoped to grab a quote from the beautiful Countess of Rothes as she boarded with her parents, her husband's cousin, and a maid. The White Star Line's slim and impeccably dressed managing director, J. Bruce Ismay, was travelling too, without his wife Florence, perhaps fueling rumours that their marriage was continuing its trajectory into unhappiness. Railway tycoon Charles Melville Hayes boarded at Southampton, as did the world-famous journalist William T. Stead with his Santa Claus-esque beard. Stead was not only a famous writer, but also a famous defender of the then popular creed of spiritualism, the belief that one could contact the dead through seances and mediums. After these passengers had presented their tickets, crew members escorted them to their cabins, or, to use the rather grander parlance preferred, their staterooms. Many then chose to go up on deck, either to the promenade deck or the boat deck, where the whitewood lifeboats were stored. The views were quite a bit better from the promenade deck below, because the lifeboats tended to obscure the sightline. Perhaps interestingly, the difference between a ship and a boat is that a ship is a nautical craft large enough to accommodate other boats on it, i.e. lifeboats. For passengers who made their way up top to watch the moment of departure, they might have noticed how crowded Southampton Harbour was rather than the pier. Southampton was one of the busiest ports in the world, but there were more ships than usual at anchor that day. In fact, there were so many of them that the red, white and blue funnels off the American Line's ship New York were tied right next to the yellow and black White Star funnels of the Oceanic, with the New York almost being tied up after a fashion to the Oceanic. Elsewhere, there were other ships crowding the area, like the Philadelphia, the St. Louis and the Majestic. The reason for this was that there wasn't enough coal. Only 4 days before the Titanic set off from Southampton, the British Miners' Federation, a trade union, had called off a 6-week miners' strike. That strike had caused a shortage in coal, which saw many of the smaller ships, like the ones tightly packed together near the Oceanic and New York, to have their voyages cancelled, and several shipping lines seemed to have raided the smaller ships' coal bunkers to get the fuel they needed to keep the larger ocean liners on schedule. Only a few minutes late, around midday, the Titanic eased off from her pier. Her propellers spun to life, smoke billowed from her operating funnels, the harbour water churned. But as the ship of dreams took her first step towards New York, a sound like gunshot tore through the crowd, followed by the agonised scream of a bystander. The Titanic was coming a lot closer to a New York than planned, as the giant amount of suction created by the Titanic's propellers had caused the New York's mooring lines to snap, lacerating a woman nearby, and slowly the New York was pulled out into the water, edging closer and closer to the Titanic. Passengers on deck thought for a moment that the New York was about to ram the Titanic, and for her captain, Edward Smith, this was a potential catastrophe. After all, only a few months earlier, the same thing had happened to the Olympic, when her size was blamed for sucking in the warship Hawke in a collision that pierced the Olympic's hull and left some of her second-class cabins exposed to the air. The whole voyage had to be cancelled. A quick-thinking, technology-loving first-class passenger managed to catch a photograph from the promenade deck which shows us just how close the New York came to hitting the Titanic, thereby forcing her to cancel her voyage. Captain Smith's quick thinking and lessons learned from the Olympic saw him cut the engines just in time, as the New York was guided back to safety before the Titanic, further delayed, resumed her journey. One of those who saw the near collision was a man called Isidore Straus, a former congressman for New York's 18th District and owner of Macy's department store. Straus was a regular transatlantic traveller, and in fact he had actually sailed as a passenger on the New York a few years earlier. After the Titanic started moving again, Straus returned down to sea deck. All the Titanic's decks, bar the boat deck, were alphabetically named. On sea deck was his suite, which he was sharing with his wife Ida. He found her writing a thank you note in the parlour of their suite because a friend from London had managed to arrange for a farewell bouquet of flowers to be sent as a surprise to the Straus's accommodation. They had discovered this delightful, thoughtful gesture when they boarded, and Ida wanted to send the friend a letter expressing her gratitude. The Titanic would be stopping to collect more passengers and deposit any letters at the French town of Cherbourg in a few hours' time, so Ida decided to get the letter done and posted rather than join her husband on deck for the send-off. Ida Straus had been born in Hesse-Darmstadt, which is now part of Germany, before emigrating to America as a child. Ida, like her husband, was a passionate defender of immigrants to America, particularly those fleeing anti-Semitic persecution in Europe and Asia. She was also a champion of educational reform and of seeing more women in public roles. The friend she wrote to, Lillian Burbage, was married to the owner of Harrods, London's famous department store, and they had helped host the Strauses during their recent stay in London. The Burbages were planning to visit America soon, where Mr. and Mrs. Straus hoped to return their hospitality. Ida's thank you note is read here by Rebecca Lenaghan, and it mentions both their suite and the near miss with the SS New York.
Dear Mrs. Burbage, you cannot imagine how pleased I was to find your exquisite basket of flowers in our sitting room on the steamer. The roses and carnations are all so beautiful in colour, and as fresh as though they had just been cut. Thank you so much for your sweet attention, which we both appreciate very much. But what a ship! So huge and so magnificently appointed. Our rooms are furnished in the best of taste and most luxuriously, and they really are rooms, not cabins. But size seems to bring its troubles. Mr. Straus, who was on deck when the start was made, said that at one time it stroked painfully near to a repetition of the Olympics experience on her first trip out of the harbour. But the danger was soon averted, and we are now well on our course across the channel to Cherbourg. Again, thanking you and Mr. Burbage for your lovely attention and good wishes, and in the pleasant anticipation of seeing you with us next summer. I am with cordial greetings, in which Mr. Straus heartily joins. Very sincerely yours, Ida R. Straus.
Ida's letter was taken off at Cherbourg while she and her husband were sitting down to their first dinner in the Titanic's dining saloon. its decoration inspired by Elizabeth I's childhood home, as well as a country house belonging to the Duke of Rutland. The Titanic was too big to dock in Cherbourg Harbour, and so a tender, a small ferry, brought passengers out from Cherbourg to the Titanic. That tender, called the Nomadic, is now the last purely White Star Line ship left in existence. It survives as a museum and tourist attraction back in its native Belfast. On Wednesday evening, as the sun set, the Nomadic brought to the Titanic more passengers, like silent movie star Dorothy Gibson, who, even before her acting career, had been famous as one of America's highest paid fashion models. Another fan of haute couture was the chic Edith Rosenbaum, a fashion journalist returning to America after attending the How could I trip up over the word Paris? Sparris? Ugh. I was too confident with the Byzantine pronunciations last time. Myophyite basiliscus Ariadne, and I fell at the word Paris. Alright, we'll take that sentence again. Another fan of haute couture was the chic Edith Rosenbaum, a fashion journalist returning to America after attending spring shows in the notoriously difficult to pronounce city of Paris. Yet another railway tycoon in the form of John Thayer boarded, as did steel mining millionaire Benjamin Guggenheim and Colonel John Jacob Astor IV, head of a family who owned so much property in Manhattan that they were nicknamed the landlords of New York. It wasn't a totally smooth operation, and not just because some passengers were uncomfortable and irritated after being kept in the Nomadic for so long because of the delay caused to the Titanic's arrival time by the New York incident in England, but also because the wind had picked up and it caused the gangway between the Titanic and the Nomadic to sway in the breeze, and a Bostonian, Ella White, went over on her ankle because of that, and she had to be carried on board by her chauffeur and a couple of stewards. Mrs. White was joined by Marie Young, a former music teacher to President Roosevelt's daughter. Marie was euphemistically referred to in Edwardian nomenclature as Ella White's companion, although the overwhelming amount of evidence researched today suggests Ella and Marie were a couple. They had first met at Atlantic City in 1910 and had been inseparable ever since. As Marie helped a wounded Ella settle into their accommodation, the Titanic raised anchor for the final time that day to begin her nighttime journey across the Celtic Sea to Ireland for her final stop. I think a travelling day is always a tiring one, and eyewitnesses mention that most of the Titanic's passengers went to bed early that Wednesday night. It was traditional not to change for dinner on the first evening of a voyage, which helped a lot of passengers find the time they needed to get their bearings, unpack, and settle in. After all, you're going to be in this cabin for pretty much a week. And I think one of the passengers said something like, you wanted to make it home-like. So they unpacked things, not just their clothes, but also some unpacked family photographs and little mementos. As she had approached the Titanic on the Nomadic, Edith Rosenbaum thought the great liner looked like Nice during Carnival, with all her lights glittering in the darkness. One by one, those lights went out as passengers, clicking their cabin heaters on against the nighttime chill outside, curled up in bed and went to sleep. The next morning, they would arrive at Queenstown for the last deposit of mail and the arrival of some new passengers. Thanks to you for listening, and also big thanks to Rebecca Lenaghan and Cáilum Carragher for reading the words of Ida Straus and Shan Bullock. Don't forget to give us a follow and tune in tomorrow for what passengers saw in Ireland and what was life like in second class. Thank you and enjoy your day.